Hi, welcome back to the second half of session 12 of World Revolutions. We're talking about Iran today, and in the historical portion in the first half today, we looked at both issues within Iranian history itself, but also issues regarding the Middle East as a whole. In regards to those larger issues affecting the Middle East, we talked about questions of secular nationalism versus the rise of Islam as not just a religious force, which it has long been since the 7th century in Middle Eastern history, but as a force around which people could identify for change, create communities of identity, just as they do when they create nations, when they promote nationalism. And not just as a source of identity for communities, but also as potentially a revolutionary force. And we are seeing this come about in Iran in looking at its national history. When we look back at this historical pattern for a moment, you notice that from the time of the creation of the Safavid Empire in the early 1500s, Iran was marked by the fact that their Shiism, that branch of Islam which emphasized the influence of religious leaders within the state itself, was dominant within Iran. And again, these are differences in emphasis and distinction between Shiism and Sunnism. But nevertheless, it is important to note that throughout Iran's history, there has been this emphasis on the idea of religious leaders playing a central role in the administration of the state. In terms of the influence of Islam, it has to do not only with this specific situation in Iran and with the idea of religious leaders having influence over the state, but also the question of the encounter with the West. We've seen a number of modern revolutions, such as in Cuba and Vietnam and elsewhere, where external domination has played a significant role in helping promote revolutionary movements. The idea of wanting to throw off foreign domination, colonialism, to establish an independent nation. And that is true in the Middle East as well, from the time of the significant arrivals of Westerners at the beginning of the 19th century as the Ottoman Empire is decaying. And it's not that Westerners hadn't been there before, but now they're coming on essentially a permanent basis with considerable influence and power as the Ottoman Empire declines. This isn't just a question in the Middle East of throwing off foreign political control, foreign economic control. This is also an issue of cultural conflict. The values of the West often at odds with the values of Islam, and particularly on an issue like secularism. Should society function on a set of secular values? Or should religion have a role to play in the political order and the social order? Should a religion set the standards of social behavior, decide how people are going to act in the social environment? Here, Islam is strongly at odds with Western ideas. The idea of materialism is the main focus of a human society, the generation of material goods, the acquisition of material goods. Or is there an aestheticism that should influence society? Here again, there is a basic conflict in values and an emphasis between Islam and Western ideas. Again, we see in Iran a very specific case of this as the Kahar dynasty builds its relationship with the British, and the British come to gain influence. There is a reaction not only over the fact that this relationship empowers the Shah, empowers the dynasty, and weakens local interests, but over the fact that this relationship means the introduction of Western ideas, the exposure to Western culture. And I mentioned, of course, that in the late 19th, early 20th century, this exposure is not that intense, but as we continue down through the century and as we come to the period that we're going to be talking about here in the second half, as we look at the period after the early 1950s, that exposure and that interaction becomes all the more intense. So we have a series of issues that pervade the Middle East in regards to the influence of Islam, and in Islam as not just a religion, but as a philosophy that can influence politics and social organization. We have an issue not only over Western influence and domination, as we see in other societies, but the conflicts between Western values and Islam. These are specifically present in Iran. And furthermore, in Iran, they are coming into play in this relationship between this dynasty that is trying to assert control over this society against the interests of a variety of groups, such as the ulema and the bazaris and the landowners. That relationship, that conflict, we see in the Kahar dynasty, but it's renewed under the Pahlavis and personified in the early 1950s in the conflict between the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister. In the end, the Shah is able to triumph with the assistance of the Americans over Mossadegh, but this only delays the final resolution of this conflict. So what's going on in Iran has deep historical roots, very specific to Iran, but it also has to do with this larger conflict over Western influence in the Middle East and the clash between Western values and the values of Islam. And we're going to see all of this played out in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in Iran in a very concrete and specific kind of way. So this revolution is going to be distinct from the other modern revolutions we've looked at, because the issues involved here are not primarily focused on questions of socialism, Marxism, anarchism. They are focused on the influence of Islam within a society, what influence it should have in the state system, in the social order itself, and at the same time, what influence foreigners should have, if any, within that system. But one point to keep in mind, beyond the very specific motivations for revolution in Iran that are distinctive because of Islam from other types of revolutions we've looked at, this is still a situation, as we have seen in many other cases, where you have a regime that is trying to modernize, whether it was the Kahars or the Pahlavis, introducing railroads and telegraphs and commercial agriculture, a regime that's trying to modernize, and at the same time, in attempting to create that process of modernization with foreign help, alienating various groups, not the least of which is a massive peasantry who are often impoverished by the system of commercial agriculture. So in that sense, some of the issues are comparable to other revolutions we've seen. An autocratic regime trying to modernize with foreign help, setting off disruptions within society, particularly among peasants, but as we will see, also urban workers as well. And that too will contribute to the revolution. So there is a unique aspect to Iran in the sense of the role that Islam plays in the ideological motivations of the revolution. But there is still this dynamic going on between a modernizing autocratic regime and its own society that also plays a fundamental role in what happens in Iran in the 1970s and beyond. So we have a merger of factors, some that we have seen before in places like Russia. I mean, this is very similar to what we see in Russia with a modernizing autocratic regime setting off a revolution because of the effects of this unequal process of modernization and the disparities in wealth that it creates. At the same time, we have somewhat distinctive situation in the importance that Islam has in providing an ideological motivation and ideological inspiration for events in Iran in the modern era. When we turn to the events after 1953, after the coup which restores the Shah to full power, and a period when the Majlis is still in existence. I mean, Majlises are still being elected, these national assemblies, but the Shah is in a much better position now to actually manipulate these assemblies as he was in the past. And his control of the military has been fully restored. The Shah sets himself the task of truly modernizing Iran. This is aside from his other goals of preserving his dynasty and looking to the United States for military assistance, etc., one of his major goals is to make Iran a truly modern nation. He has the same kind of goal that leaders throughout the Third World aspired to in this period, to make this a modern industrial power equal to any in the world. And he sets about this task following many of the same kinds of policy initiatives that would be repeated by other Third World leaders in the second half of the 20th century. To improve transportation, build more modern roads, build power plants, help develop heavy industry so that Iran could be a true industrial power. One of the ideas here was to take the oil industry, which is producing revenues but also provides an incredibly cheap source of energy, and use it as the base upon which to build this larger industrial order. And it certainly seemed possible in Iran. Iran had a plentiful population, and again, with this cheap energy source, the possibilities seem limitless. Other societies were not gifted with this kind of cheap energy, and it would be hard for them to industrialize. But from the perspective of the Shah in the 1950s and 60s, here was a golden opportunity to carry out a rapid process of modernization, of industrialization. And of course, all of this was going to be done with substantial support from foreigners. Foreigners, particularly Westerners, were to be encouraged to invest in Iran, and not just in the oil industry, but in modern industrial plants and power plants, etc. At the same time, it was a given of developmental strategies at this time that agriculture had to be more efficient than ever before. Efficient in part to feed what was assumed to be a growing industrial population in the urban centers, and at the same time to provide additional exports in the form of agricultural products. As a result, considerable emphasis is given to the development of agribusiness. This means allowing commercial enterprises, corporations, to take a major hand in developing agricultural properties in the countryside. So the real initiative here is not to turn over land to peasants and create, a more equitable peasant economy. This is to develop large commercial enterprises run by foreign corporations from the United States and Europe, whether they were cattle, sheep ranching, grain production. All of this was to be done on an enormous scale using the most modern of technologies to supply both the internal market to some degree, but really the main emphasis to produce additional goods for export. Now, as I said, this part of the plan did not aim at creating a more equitable agrarian society with peasant holdings that would supply peasants with their basic needs and with a certain degree of independence as a result of owning their own land. However, the Shah is sensitive to the question of stability, and he recognizes, and was urged by his American advisors, to accept the priority of land reform. The Americans are terribly sensitive to the potential for subversive action among peasants. After all, anyone could read modern history and realize that both the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution had been revolutions in which peasants played a major role, particularly in the Chinese Revolution, and in other revolutions since then. Vietnam, for example. So here was an area of real concern, not so much out of concern for social justice as a concern for how to create a stable society. And if land were turned over to peasants, hopefully this would stabilize this very large and significant group in Iranian society and provide a stable social platform on which to build this modern economy. So as a result, in 1962, the Shah does undertake a land reform program. The problem is that its scope is extremely narrow, and it does not intend to offend the interests of large landowners. Essentially, what the government will do is buy up lands from large landowners. They are in a position, as a result of this process, to keep those lands which are most valuable within their estate and sell off to the peasants only those lands that they find to be least productive. So that while tens of thousands of families will receive land under this program, it is a tiny fraction of the people who need land and who have lost land in the past decades of commercialization of agriculture. And the land which they receive, as you would imagine from this process, is among the least productive land in the provinces where this occurs. So we have a land reform program, but it's barely scratching the surface. It is not doing enough to really stabilize the rural population. In fact, if anything, in the years ahead, as agribusiness enterprises accelerate and as the development of hydroelectricity expands, peasants feel themselves being put upon. Land that is used for grazing, for example, is being lost to agribusiness. Land used for agriculture and grazing is being lost to hydroelectric projects as they dam up rivers and flood vast amounts of land that were previously used by peasants, either for growing crops or grazing animals. If anything, the total loss of land and the pressures upon the peasant population are accelerating as a result of the modernization efforts on the part of the regime. Land reform proves to be so insignificant, it can hardly hope to stem the tide of resentment that is swelling in the countryside as this process continues. There is no question that the modernization process spurs economic growth in Iran, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s. The overall economy, exports, gross national product, however you measure economic growth in Iran, it is definitely expanding in the 1960s and 1970s. And indeed, spurred on in part in the 1970s by the Shah's own very aggressive oil policy. He is among the most ardent advocates of price increases by the OPEC cartel. So all of this massive investment of oil revenues into industry and agribusiness, plus rising oil revenues during the 1970s, helped spur economic growth. The problem is that the disparities between rich and poor are growing at the same time. There's no question that the tide of growth is lifting the whole society up in terms of total revenues, total income, total wealth. But the distance between the rich and poor is growing ever greater. And at the same time, more and more families are being forced to abandon the countryside because there is not enough land to support them, because they have lost land through these various mechanisms that the modernization process has called for. So this is not a revolution that will be driven by economic desperation. This is not Russia in 1917, devastated by war, where starvation stocked the urban population and much of the rural population. This is a country whose economy is growing. The problem is, the process, the rich and poor are growing ever further apart, and if anything, the poor more desperate than ever before. Among those who suffer in this process are what we would call a sort of classic middle class, the bazaris, the traditional merchants, the people who for generation upon generation have sold products in the urban bazaars of Iran's urban centers. I mean, these people have a history and a role to play in Islamic societies that dates back more than 1,000 years. But in this new era, they are facing an economic squeeze. Many of them, particularly in Tehran, the capital, and in the largest of the urban centers, are threatened by this modernization process. Why? Well, one of the things they do is manufacture and sell carpets, rugs. They do it with hand looms through family and people that they hire on a small-scale basis. But now, with the modernization process, modern rug factories are being developed to produce rugs by machine. Others who are engaged in typical commercial retail marketing find their position threatened by the rise of large retail enterprises. You know, the Iranian version of the department store, the supermarket, threatens their livelihood as well. So these people see in this process not necessarily a land of opportunity, but a land of destruction of their position within Iranian society. And it's worth noting, although we'll get into this more in a moment, that the Bazaris tend to be, as a group, very traditional. They are very closely wedded to Islam and to the ulamas, and the signs of westernization, of Western culture in particular, are not welcomed by these people. So they have resentment both at the turn of economic events as it affects them, and also at the culture of Iran as it is being influenced by Western powers. As for the people in the countryside, their desperation drives them to migrate into the cities, first by the tens of thousands, and then by the early 1970s by the hundreds of thousands. Peasants, particularly young people, who cannot support themselves. There simply isn't enough land. I mean, some of this is the result of the modernization program. Some of it is simply the result of the failure of the agrarian reform to adequately provide for people. And part of it is the growth in population. All of these three converge, meaning that for more and more peasant families, there may be land for the oldest son, but for the other sons that come after that, there simply is no land for them. They're going to have to go to the urban centers if they're going to find work. And the problem they then encounter in the urban areas, like Tehran, like Tabriz, is that there isn't enough work. The modern industries that are being created are highly mechanized, so they don't hire tens of thousands of new workers. They hire a few hundred at a time. That's how they are able to achieve efficiency. The Shah's idea is you bring in the most modern of industries. We can afford it. We have these oil revenues. We want modern plants. We want the most efficient types of manufacturers. Fine, but these are not going to soak up the tens and then hundreds of thousands of poor peasants who are pouring in from the countryside. And remember, as I said earlier, there's people in the countryside who are particularly close to the ulema, to the clergy. They have played a critical role in their lives down through the centuries, both as religious leaders, but also as members of the judiciary. Essentially, the law is the law of Islam and has been enforced down through the centuries. Its courts have consisted of judgments made by the ulema. So they serve not only a religious function, they also have a judicial function. These are people of enormous influence in the countryside. And these peasants, when they come to the urban areas, have a strong affinity, a close relationship with the ulema and with the basic tenets of Islam. They have at the same time a deep resentment of the Shah's modernization policies, which they feel have brought them to this point in their lives. So the urban poor, who are really, for the most part, recent migrants from the countryside, represent a powerful force in support of the interests of the clergy and the fundamental ideas of Islam. Now, I said the Bazaris had a resentment of aspects of westernization that they saw taking place in Iran in the years after 1953. And there are some specific areas where this is occurring that made the past encounter with the West and the past resentment of secularism and materialism seem insignificant compared to what was going on after 1953, because now there is this very consistent and well-financed policy of modernization, which in itself implies westernization, because how are you going to go about this process of modernization? We're going to build factories and communication systems. Well, but who's going to do that? Where are you going to get the equipment, the technology, and the technicians? Where are you going to bring them in from the West? So you not only have that, but you also have this influx of Western culture itself, because these are the years in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s when more than ever Western culture can be readily transmitted to other societies. We not only have radio and movies, we now have television, we have the rapid production of printed materials. All of this now is going to flood Iran with an exposure to Western culture. Some of these efforts were very conscious efforts by the Shah in terms of changing Iranian society. For example, he began developing schools of theology at universities. Now, this might sound like, well, this is a very religious man. He's promoting the study of religion at universities. Nothing could have been less acceptable to the ulema or the Islamic clergy than that policy, because what he was doing, as far as they were concerned, was trying to take from their control the training of their acolytes, the training of their successors, and put it into secular universities. They feared that the faculty at these schools of theology would be people favorable to the Shah's ideas about the process of modernization, and that he would corrupt the training of the ulema as a result. So this becomes an issue of hot contention between the Shah and the ulema. It is not, from their perspective, an attempt to promote Islam, but rather an attempt to distort Islam, to try to create a clergy that will find the process of modernization and westernization more acceptable. Another area of conflict has to do with coeducation, with allowing women to be educated along with men. And this was prohibited in Iran under the Islamic faith, that they were to be separate courses of education for women and for men. The idea that women would be attending universities along with men was deeply resented, not just by the clergy, but, as I mentioned earlier, by the bazaris. And they would be the ones who, in many cases, would have the wherewithal to allow their children to attend university. And the idea that their daughters were going to be sitting in classes with male students was something they found absolutely reprehensible. So again, we have this conflict over issues of modernization and westernization. From one perspective, from the Shah's perspective, look, this is all to the good because this will create a more efficient and effective workforce. We can train men and women together to be this modern technological workforce. But from the perspective of the ulema and the bazaris in particular, this is an anathema to their faith and their practices. At the same time, the Shah is probably trying to build a bit of support among women as well by the idea that he is liberalizing their regime and allowing coeducation. Another area that creates conflict is the question of secular judges. As I mentioned a moment ago, the clergy had a role not just as clergymen as we would think of clergymen in the West, but as judges. If indeed, as is true, Islam has a series of precepts and rules governing society and social behavior, it was only logical that the decisions regarding the enforcement of such laws would be left to the clergy as well, to members of the Islamic clergy or the ulema. So the ulema had served as judges as well as clergymen. And the idea of appointing judges who were not clergymen, again, ran contrary to this tradition and was another challenge to the power of the clergy in Iranian society. So here again, just as with the creation of the schools of theology, the ulema see this as a deliberate attempt on the part of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to undermine their authority and their influence, and ultimately to undermine the power and influence of Islam within Iranian society itself. And then there came the reduction of subsidies to the clergy. The government had long subsidized the theological students at Qom, which is the religious center, and provided subsidies for the clergy to support them in their religious activities. The Shah, in reducing these, of course, is arguing, of course, that he's creating a more rational, objective kind of government. But for the clergy, again, it's an anathema. It is a threat to their position and their role in society. All of these things they see as an attempt to diminish their influence and to diminish the influence of Islam. Western dress and work opportunities for women were another source of conflict within the society at this time. The idea that women would essentially abandon traditional, the chador and veiling, and be dressed in Western clothes, which did occur, and it should be said, not among all Iranian women by any stretch of the imagination, tended to be urban, middle, upper class women, and that they would have job opportunities working alongside men in corporations. These things, again, were a trigger for conflict within this society because they violated past practices and they certainly violated what were seen as basic principles of Islam itself. So in pursuing his program of modernization, the Shah, by these measures, is making a series of steps, or taking a series of steps that lead him to direct conflict with the ulema and with the bazaris, and to some extent with women as well. I mean, this, as much as some of these steps may be seen as liberating women, not all Iranian women were supportive of these ideas, in part because they did clash with existing practices, and in part because many women resented what was, besides what was supposedly a liberalizing regime, what was at heart an autocratic administration. For all he may liberalize in terms of allowing women to receive co-education with men and allowing them to wear Western dress and work alongside men in companies. The fact is, the regime remained highly politically repressive. This becomes another factor in prompting opposition to the regime. It is not just a question of undermining the influence of the clergy or Islam. There is also the issue of political repression. The Shah regularly manipulated elections, would close or dismiss the Majlis whenever he found it not to his liking, and of course would use the Savak to repress free speech and free thought. The idea that one would take up positions that seriously challenged the Shah and his regime to be a serious and vehement critic of the regime would almost certainly bring a visit from the Savak and was likely to lead to one's arrest and even possible torture and disappearance. So this is not a regime that is in any ways a liberalized version of earlier administrations in Iran. It is as autocratic, if not more autocratic, because it has more tools at its command to repress the population than any that preceded. There is, in addition, the fact that with the modernization process come all of these Western influences, as I mentioned earlier. Flooding in of Americans in particular, but also Europeans as technicians, as teachers, and of course their ideas and values at sharp variance with those of much of Iranian society. But even more than that, the constant inpouring of American movies and books, radio transmissions, television programs, as television becomes more and more popular in Iran in the 1960s and 70s, and much of what we might take in Western society as just slightly off-color humor, Iranians may find appalling, and much of the materialism that we take for granted in our own programs, again, runs contrary to the basic values of Iranians. So we have a variety of issues that are coming to the fore. The inequitable process of modernization that does actually harm to peasants rather than helping them. The issue of the steps taken by the Shah, such as the theology schools, to undermine the power of the ulema and the influence of Islam, and the political repression by the regime, and finally the influx of Western values, Western culture during these years. Inevitably, these conflicts lead to open popular unrest. And frequently, the ulema, although they are not the only group opposing the Shah, I must point out, again, with all revolutions, we tend to focus on, who were the winners, like with Cuba, we talk largely about Castro and his movement, despite the fact that there were other resistance forces, because Castro won. Well, here, too, in Iran, there are other groups that oppose the Shah besides the religious clergy. The National Front, for example, Mossadegh's movement and others like it survived, even a version of the Today, the Communist Party, had survived the 1953 coup and were still opposed to the regime, and were leading much of the opposition. But in the end, it's the clergy who are going to become the primary advocates and leaders of this revolutionary movement. They are the ones who are going to be the final winners in this revolutionary process. But very early on, they have a role to play. Again, they are leaders in their communities, they are judges, they are religious leaders. It is inevitable that people will look to them. And of course, in this instance, where we often think of clergymen as relatively conservative, of trying to maintain the status quo, being opposed to vehement action against the state, here it is the clergy themselves who are anxious to take up the pulpit against the government because they themselves see their position, their status, and their influence in society seriously threatened by what this regime is doing. Among those in this process originally was a young clergyman who eventually received the title of Ayatollah, which is among the highest honors, if you will, titles that one can receive as a member of the Islamic clergy. The Ayatollah Khomeini, from early in his life as a young clergyman in his 20s, in the 1940s, was an opponent of the Pahlavi dynasty. Felt that it was pursuing this goal, even before the 1953 coup, of modernization and westernization, of threatening the interests and the values of a truly Islamic society. And eventually, his criticism of the Shah and his policies towards the clergy forced him into exile in 1965 for a time in Iraq, and eventually he would go to France, and he would be in Paris in the late 1970s during the unfolding of the final stages of the revolutionary upheaval. So there is a process evolving in Iran in the 1950s and 1960s and into the 1970s of growing unrest at the regime, and it is focused on the issues of inequitable modernization, political autocracy, the undermining of the influence of the clergy and of Islam itself. And we see within this society leadership, particularly by the clergy, because they have a vested interest in part their status is being threatened. But we also see that they would have, along with them, strong support from the Bazaris, whose own economic position is being undermined and who are deeply disturbed by what they see as a violation of basic Islamic social practices, such as the co-education at the universities. And we see that out in the countryside, the leadership of the clergy is powerful among the peasant population, and that hundreds of thousands of these people have poured into the urban areas seeking work as a result of the loss of land in the countryside and have been unable to find such work. They form this large amorphous force in the urban areas of unemployed, underemployed, people who find work as street hawkers of simple consumer goods. This provides a volatile mass, people who are sympathetic to the cause of the clergy and bear strong antipathy towards their regime because of what has happened in the countryside and the lack of economic opportunity in the urban areas. By the late 1970s, these protests are becoming open and vehement despite the activities of the Savak and of the secret police. While during the 1960s, their actions in arresting and suppressing leaders of dissent were effective in either forcing people into exile or causing their disappearance. By the 1970s, mass protests are becoming more frequent and finally start to reach a head at the end of the 1970s. One of the major rebellions occurs in Tabriz in January of 1978. And Tabriz was a classic case of the coming together of the social forces I had just mentioned. It was a major industrial city at this time in northern Iran, a city, despite its industrial base, with a very large unemployed or underemployed population. And the protests against the regime that break out at this time are focused both on economic issues and issues of religion. As a result of the demonstrations, the Shah turns to his most reliable instrument of support, the military. There is massive movement of troops into Tabriz, crowds are fired upon, and perhaps 500 to 700 people are killed as a result of these demonstrations in January of 1978. This is the point where the revolution is starting to take on its full momentum, where we now have massive demonstrations against the regime, and the regime is forced to use something more than the secret police in order to restore order. Now the regular army has to be brought out to try to crush these demonstrators. A comparable incident occurs in Tehran just a few months later in September of 1978. And here again, mass demonstrations in the streets are met with outright repression as the tanks begin to roll and as the regular troops are brought in from the army to shoot at demonstrators. Hundreds more are killed. So in this space of time between January and September of 1978, we see this groundswell of opposition to the regime now resulting in massive demonstrations and forcing the regime to use outright military force to maintain itself in power. However, the events in Tehran have another significance, and that is that as a result of that demonstration and its repression, there is growing unrest in the ranks of the military. Not at the senior ranks. The top officers of the military remain completely loyal to the Shah, and most officers do in general. However, in the ranks of the enlisted men, many of them, again, recruits, or draftees, I should say, from the countryside. These people are increasingly disturbed by the idea that they are being asked to fire on their own countrymen, and that many of those demonstrations are being led by religious leaders. The idea of pointing a rifle at an Islamic mullah, at a clergyman, would be an absolute anathema to these people. What is happening in the latter months of 1978 is that discipline within the military is breaking down. What becomes apparent at the end of 1978 to the senior officers in the military is that they can no longer rely upon their troops to go out and crush these demonstrations. As a result, the demonstrations that occur in the latter months of 1978 are largely met without military repression, because the Shah can no longer count upon his armed forces to go out and shoot at these people. The leadership of the clergy helps make that a reality. So the most critical institution upon which the Pahlavi dynasty had built its fortunes ever since 1925 was now disintegrating right before his eyes, because he could not count upon the military to deliver the repressive forces that were needed to keep the country under his control. It's with that realization that the Shah decides that he is going to remove himself from the country and leaves Iran in January of 1979. Allegedly, he's going for health reasons, and he was ill. He would die not too long after the revolution itself. But the fact is, it was hoped that by removing the Shah himself, who was seen as the personification of all that was wrong with Iran by the protesters, that perhaps order could be restored, that civilian leaders still representing his interests could hopefully restore order if he himself was not there. And perhaps, if not him, then his son could eventually be installed as the new Shah. Well, that would never happen, because the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, would never return to Iran and would die in exile. And events were fast spinning out of control, not only from the hands of the Shah and officials loyal to him, but even to more moderate opponents of the regime. People who followed in the tradition of Mossadegh, the secular nationalists, if you will. It's not the most accurate term with which to describe them, but nevertheless, the people that wanted to see essentially the creation of some type of constitutional regime, but were not anxious to see a full-fledged Islamic theocracy created. These people were to have their day briefly in 1979, but eventually they would be unable to control events. The more moderate forces take over soon after the Shah's departure, but their rule is soon overshadowed in February of 1979 with the return from exile of the Ayatollah Khomeini. His return to Iran after some 14 years of exile is met by this massive outpouring of popular support. And again, control of the cities, control of the capital and Tabriz, the other major cities, is critical. The military itself, a bit unclear who they're supporting at any given moment. The senior officers were certainly in favor of the Shah. The enlisted men were opposed to going out and fighting on behalf of the Shah. So control of the cities is really up for grabs at this point. And the force that is most dominant at this time are the poor, the recent immigrants from the countryside, particularly young men who have migrated to the urban areas over the past 10 to 15 years. And they are loyal followers of the Ayatollah Khomeini and the ulema. So as a result, the real power in the situation, although it is not immediately apparent upon Khomeini's return in February of 1979, lies with the ulema and with the forces that they now influence in the urban areas. If someone is going to control the streets of Tehran, it's going to be the clergy and their young followers. As a result of that power reality, it is the Ayatollah Khomeini and the ulema in general and their supporters who are now able to push aside the moderates and create an Islamic Republic. One of the defining events comes with the seizure of the U.S. Embassy, when dozens of Americans are taken hostage by young followers of the Ayatollah, and they are held hostage for more than a year. This was one of the revolutionary moments that was really going to force people to make choices. Were they going to adamantly support the seizure of the embassy and this breaking with ties to the West? The closest foreign ally that Iran had had for decades was the United States. Were they going to completely turn their backs on this? Or were they going to seek some kind of resolution, some kind of negotiated resolution of the situation? The moderates were looking for some kind of resolution. They were unwilling to take this radical step of completely breaking ties with the Americans and isolating themselves from the West. And that was one of the moments that helped determine which way power was going to flow at that point, because clearly the population supported this radical step, and as the Ayatollah and his followers who were able to take advantage of this opportunity and fully assert control, and the moderates by the middle of 1979 are effectively out of power. Out of that situation, the Ayatollah and the ulema create the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979. Now, it's important to note that this new republic, replacing the old dynasty, is a system of elected government. It has a majlis, a prime minister, just as in the past, but there is no Shah, there is no monarchy to rule over the situation. It clears to be a classic parliamentary system. So in that sense, it very much draws on Western traditions and on Iran's own traditions of the majlis. However, there is also a principle at work here called government of the Islamic jurist, meaning that while the government may well function as an elected constitutional parliamentary form of government, all major government decisions are ultimately subject to review and approval by the Islamic jurist, the senior Islamic clergyman of the country, the Ayatollah. And indeed, the Ayatollah Khomeini holds that position until his death some 10 years after the revolution. And his successor has held that position since that time. There is a council of elders that also rules on decisions made by the majlis and made by the prime minister and by the president. So we have all of the essential institutions of a civilian regime, but you also have this overlay of control by the clergy. And even when you look at the majlis itself, overwhelmingly, the vast majority of the representatives elected to the majlis are members of the clergy, in part because to run for office in Iran, you have to have the approval of the clergy itself. Not surprisingly, most of the people they approve are members of the ulema. So we have all the traditional trappings, if you will, and institutions of a civilian government, but we also have control at the top through this Islamic jurist, through a council of elders and a series of other committees that rule on critical issues and policies within Iran. So this really functions ultimately, particularly in the first decade after the revolution begins, as a theocracy, control by the clergy. And in the process, the regime sets about taking revolutionary steps to alter Iran, some of them very much in keeping with what we have seen in other revolutions, one of which is to eliminate the elements of the old regime. This includes the execution of General Nasiri. Who is General Nasiri? Well, at the time of the 53 coup, he was Colonel Nasiri, the young officer charged with delivering the royal order to dismiss Mossadegh, which was never successfully delivered. But after that, he had risen through the ranks of the Savak, and at the time of the revolution was the leader of the secret police. So his execution marks a major step in disassembling the old regime and its autocratic control of Iranian society. The regime also begins a fairly effective program of land reform, something that, again, the Shah was only marginally interested in and only willing to do in an almost symbolic fashion. Now there is substantial land reform taking place in Iran, and this certainly helps build support for the regime, fulfills the needs of one of its basic constituencies, and that is the peasantry in the countryside, who will benefit from this redistribution of land that takes place after 1979. And here, too, we're dealing with a policy that we see repeated time and time again. We talk about Nicaragua and Cuba and Vietnam and China and Russia, and all of them, one form or another, try to resolve the problems of the peasantry, usually through some type of land reform program. In addition, we also see a renewed effort at state control of the economy, nationalization of private enterprise, hotels, banks, factories. This runs along two courses that, again, we have seen in other revolutions. First, it is an assertion of nationalism, because who controls much of this? Some of it's controlled by the Shah and his family, or was controlled by them, but much of it is foreign controlled. And here, the regime is asserting control by the state. And this will include, ultimately, the most important part of the economy at this time, and that is the oil industry, controlled largely by the Americans. It will eventually be nationalized as well. So on the one hand, we have this assertion of nationalism, of national control. On the other hand, it is also designed ultimately to try to spur modernization. As much as the type of modernization program pursued by the Shah antagonized the clergy and other elements of Iranian society, such as the bazaris and the peasants, nevertheless, these revolutionaries, as all revolutionaries in the 20th century, aspire to creating a modern, effective national economy. And as the other 20th century revolutionaries, so too the revolutionaries in Iran, as much as they are creating an Islamic Republic, as much as they see this as an Islamic revolution, nevertheless, they too aspire to create a system which can supply the basic needs of their population and provide them in abundance. There is a certain contradictory element in all of this, or potential conflict. When we think about the aspirations of a modern society to create this wealth and to distribute vast amounts of material goods, at what point does that become the be-all and end-all of a society versus simply trying to create a sound material base for an Islamic society, which might stress an aesthetic set of values. In other words, self-denial. We don't need to, inundate ourselves with consumer goods. At what point do you draw the line? Well, that's something we're going to discuss a bit more in a moment. But it's clear that modernization, the idea of building an effective, efficient, powerful modern economy, became one of the policies of the Islamic Republic right from the time that the ulema and their followers seized power in 1979. And again, they follow a strategy that had been pursued through much of the world, through just about every revolution we've looked at in the 20th century, and that was to give the state the major role in controlling the economy and trying to promote this modern economic system. So as much as we've been stressing the Islamic character of this revolution and the conflicts with the West and conflicts with Western values, nevertheless, it's also true that one of their aspirations was to create a modern economic system in Iran, and to do so following policies of a state-run economy, much like the socialist and Marxist regimes we've seen elsewhere in the world. Now, At the same time that we see this similarity in terms of economic policy, of wanting a modern, efficient economy and using, state policy to control that economy and promote modernization, there is another similarity in the sense of striking out at foreign domination. And here we see this with the breaking of American ties, both the taking of the hostages and the nationalization of American oil companies. If we go back and remember the history of Iran, of this relationship between the Shah's regime and foreign interests, first the British and then the Americans, particularly after 1953, these measures both asserted Iranian nationalism and struck out at the domination by foreign powers, which Iranians had been so sensitive to ever since the 19th century and the coming of the British in 1857. This is something, again, that we would expect to find in just about any 20th century revolution, because we have found it in every 20th century revolution, is this reaction against the foreigners. Foreigners who have come to dominate our economy. Even if we completely put aside the issue of Islam and the influence of Islamic ideas within this revolution, within this Islamic Republic, the fact is we could take this set of actions and say essentially they are replicating actions taken by the Nicaraguans, by the Cubans, by the Chinese, the Vietnamese, striking out at those who have dominated you and asserting your national independence through these actions. So in this sense, again, the Islamic Revolution is not that different from other 20th century revolutions that we have seen. However, that is not entirely true, because the revolution has also focused very much on the issues of values and of culture. The concern for Cubans, for others that we have seen, was essentially the fact that other nations had imposed economic and political control upon them. And we see this again in Iran. But with Iran, there is another issue about values that is as fundamentally important as the questions of nationalism and the questions of foreign control. And within Iran itself, there is an effort to create truly Islamic society. For example, within Iran, women are now, after the revolution, to wear the chador, to wear this full-length robe, to be covered all times and outdoors. Fraternization between men and women, other than, of course, a brother and a sister, a husband, wife. Socialization in public of the opposite sexes is strongly prohibited. The fundamental rules of Islam as interpreted by the clergy are to be rigorously enforced in Iran at this time, and special units of police, if you want to call them that, cultural police, are to enforce these kinds of restrictions. So this is to be, in the eyes of the ulema, a classic Islamic society. And the Quran is to be strictly enforced as they interpret it throughout Islamic society, throughout Iranian society. It is to be a true Islamic society, guided in every aspect, whether it's relations between the sexes, if it's types of entertainment that are allowed, etc. All of this is to be governed by the rules of Islam and strictly enforced by the government and its police forces. That also means that in addition to Islam governing every aspect of society, that the government is also going to control external influences that affect people's values, people's cultural perceptions. For example, the government has prohibited and continues to prohibit, as best it can, the use of satellite dishes to prevent Iranians from watching television transmitted from outside that would contain programming which promotes values that they consider an anathema to Islam. Western movies and television programs in general were to be prohibited in this fashion. The enforcement is not entirely effective these days, but it is essentially outlawed. The internet is allowed and promoted, but it is also to be carefully controlled, blocking out websites that, again, are considered to be subversive in the sense of undermining basic values of an Islamic society. The Culture Ministry has gone so far as to ban Barbie dolls and to create dolls that more closely instead of Barbie, you have a female doll who's dressed in traditional Iranian garb, and her male mate is her brother. Okay, so the two dolls are sister and brother, rather than having Barbie and her boyfriend and Barbie, wandering around in a bikini or something, driving a sports car. This doll is to symbolize, what are the values of this society. In terms of control of the book trade. Again, here we have a situation where books are carefully monitored in terms of imports of books, technical books, etc., welcome, medical books, etc., but books that express cultural values that are at odds with the values of this society are to be banned. So we have not only the effort to see that Islam is the dominant influence in people's personal values, but also in society as a whole, but also to reject influences from the outside, to create an Islamic culture which is free of the influences of the West that stress values like secularism and materialism. This is to be a society in which the traditional values of Islam, as interpreted by the clergy, are to reign supreme. Now, there is a question here about how effective this process can be over time. Can you achieve modernization, create that modern economy, and at the same time avoid these influences from outside of Iran, from outside of Islamic societies? For example, if you're going to have modern education, modern training, you need the internet. But inevitably, blocks on the internet are only marginally effective. You can always find ways, to take one site and jump to another and use linkages from various sites to gain access to information. If you're going to accept the technologies from the West, don't you inevitably wind up accepting to one degree or another the cultural values, or at least exposure to those values? You may not accept the values, but at least exposure to these values, these precepts, this world vision. An example. With the land reform, many families in the countryside have done fairly well and are much better off than they once were. As a result, many of them were able to acquire an appliance that they felt was critical to their lives, and that was a television, along with a satellite dish. So you've got families who are the rock bed of the revolution, who are the very ones, in many cases, who are taking television and watching television, and even if they can't afford satellite dishes, can at least pick up programs from other countries around the region, which often show images from Western cultural vehicles, films, etc. So can you prevent this process? Can you modernize and give people a better life and more access to material goods and avoid, at the same time, them being exposed to these values and ideas? And this is one of the central conflicts within Iran today. Now, as all of this is unfolding, this effort to create a truly Islamic society, Iran encountered other problems that made the solution to these conflicts all that much more difficult to arrive at in the short term. One of which was war with Iraq, which lasted almost a decade, from 1980 to 1988, and was enormously damaging to both countries in terms of loss of life and economic losses. The reasons behind the war are in part conflicts over border territories, but also conflicts over power. With Iraq fearful of Iran's reemergence as the dominant force in the area and wishing to assert its own power. Conflicts over the question of Arab versus a Farsi nation. Conflicts over minority groups, for example, Shiites, and the complex mix of Shiism, Sunnis, and even Christians in Iraq versus the dominance of Shiism, almost the complete domination of Shiism in Iran. But the war is most important for the enormous damage it did to the Islamic Republic in these years in trying to build a prosperous economy and begin to achieve some of the goals set out by the revolutionaries in 1979. On the other hand, it actually allowed the Ayatollah and his regime to ever more strictly enforce the rules concerning social control within their society, because they could justify them on the grounds that in times of war, such controls are all the much more necessary, and that violation of even the most minimal of social restrictions was unpatriotic, was a challenge to the survival of the regime itself because of the war that was raging. At the end of the war, the Ayatollah himself passes from the scene with his death in 1989. And at that time, the revolution's fervor still remained strong, as seen by the enormous outpouring of grief, the massive number of people who poured out into the streets to express their grief over the loss of the Ayatollah in 1989. At this time, Iran's president was a man named Ali Akbar Rafsanjani. Rafsanjani was himself a clergyman, was a member of the revolutionary forces that had brought the republic to power in 1979, but he was somewhat of a pragmatist at the same time, trying to moderate some of the forces within Iran, particularly those who viewed this as an opportunity to spread an Islamic revolution across the Middle East and into other parts of the globe. However, his larger problem, beyond controlling some of the more radical forces within the regime, were the economic woes that Iran had suffered during the war and has continued to suffer for more than a decade since the war ended. And that is a slowing economy, an economy which is failing to generate a significant number of jobs. The young, middle-class, university-educated youth of Iran are constantly facing problems of finding significant employment. The oil economy, certainly up until very recently, suffered from very low world prices and was, in the minds of many, inefficiently administered. And the state economy in general, state management, proved to be ineffective and often corrupt. So the economy has stagnated for almost 2 decades now and created increasing dissent within Iran. But that dissent is focused not only on the problems of economic opportunity, particularly for the urban populations, which benefited little from the revolution in a real sense, the peasants who probably got the major economic boost from the revolution. But in addition, growing opposition to the very strict social controls instituted to try to create this authentic Islamic society. Most of Iran's people within the next couple of years will have been born since the revolution in 1979. There is now an enormous generation of young people in their late teens and 20s who have no memory of the revolution itself and of the Shah's regime, and at the same time are concerned with assertions of individual freedom and freedom from some of the restrictions on cultural expression that they find so restrictive. Those dissents over economic and cultural issues led in 1997 to the election of this man as president, Mohammad Khatami, or Khatami as it's pronounced. And here I've titled this last segment, Thermidor. Is this the reversal of the revolution? Certainly Khatami asserted his intention of liberalizing the regime. And just within the past few months, new elections were held for the Majlis, the National Assembly, and reformers identified with Khatami won an overwhelming majority in the new National Assembly. So there is this wave of sentiment that is gaining political expression, which seeks to liberalize the regime. Now, what liberalization means is both a political and an economic change. In terms of politics, an attempt to open up the political process. Right now, even after the most recent elections, it is largely members of the clergy who can gain election to the National Assembly. There's an effort to open that process up and make it possible for secular figures to become significant in the national political process. There is an effort to liberalize in the area of newspaper and magazine publication to make freedom of expression more of a reality. Over a year ago, there were riots and demonstrations because of police repression at the National University. All of this growing out of a student publication which had criticized and satirized the clergy. Now, there's an effort to liberalize that part of the political process as well, and efforts to create more opportunities for freedom of expression by women. There is also a liberalization process focused on the economy, to privatize much of the economy. This started before Khatami was elected, but has been relatively slow in taking off. Efforts to privatize railroads, the tobacco industry, communications, it has begun, but at a very slow pace. So in this sense, there appears to be aspects of a Thermidorian reaction, if you will, both against the political control exercised by the clergy and against the cultural controls that the regime has instituted, and finally, a reversal of some sorts of the state-controlled economy which they have created since 1979. Now, how far will this process proceed? It is still unclear because all of these issues are still being contended. It remains a fact that there is still the ultimate Islamic jurist. There are still committees of clergy who rule on the right of publications to publish, who rule on the ability of individuals to run for public office. So the battle is by no means concluded, but there is certainly a reaction in process. How far that will go is yet to be seen. Turning finally to our favorite three, causes, goals, and effects. In terms of causes of the Iranian Revolution, most of these are quite familiar to us in terms of looking at 20th century revolutions, particularly foreign domination. The Iranian Revolution, like other revolutions, was designed to throw off foreign control. The British, the Americans. Inequitable modernization is another factor that we have seen time and again. And as I was pointing out earlier, there's a striking similarity between Tsarist Russia and Iran under the Pahlavi dynasty, two autocratic regimes trying to modernize and creating situations in which peasants and urban groups suffer significantly as a result of this process, and situations in which foreigners appear to gain considerable advantage in these modernization processes. So in that regard, again, strong similarities. And an assertion of Iranian nationalism. And the break with the Americans is in part very much a classic exercise in revolutionary nationalism, something we've seen repeated time and again in modern revolutions, from Mexico to Cuba to China. However, with all of this said, we still have to look at this issue of Islam and Westernization, and this is something that does give a distinctive character to the Iranian Revolution, because unlike other revolutions that were focused largely on throwing off foreign political control, foreign economic domination, creating more equitable societies, certainly this was true in Iran as well, but here there is another fundamental conflict that both pervades the violent struggle and the later revolutionary government. And that is a reaction against Westernization, against Western values, an attempt to reassert Islam's values and the influence that Islam should have in society and in government. Of course, in Iran, there is this particular tradition within Shiism of the clergy having a central role to play in government. But this is the distinctive feature, this question of the conflict between Islam and Western values that gives the distinctive quality to the Islamic Revolution. In terms of goals, again, many of these are hardly new to us in terms of being anti-imperialist, wanting to throw off foreign domination, nationalism, asserting national independence, modernization, and land for peasants. But asserting the creation of Islamic society, asserting the values of Islamic fundamentalism, this is distinctive. And finally, the revolutionary forces, the peasantry, the urban poor, the middle class, and the clergy, formed a close alliance in seeking out these goals. And while all of them had distinct concerns, such as land for the peasants, nevertheless, all of them shared this concern of reasserting Islamic values within Iranian society. As to the long-term effects of the revolution, many postulated a few years ago a sweeping change in the Middle East led by Islamic revolutions. That has not been the case. But certainly, Iranian society has been fundamentally altered. It is a far more liberal and at least quasi-democratic society than it has been before. It has reasserted Islamic values as never before and thrown off foreign control and reasserted Iranian nationalism. As much as the more extreme aspects of the Islamic Republic may be altered in the future in terms of cultural values and social control, nevertheless, a shift towards a more democratic regime, an assertion of nationalism, and the assertion of the values in Islamic society are likely to remain the permanent heritage of this revolution that swept Iran in 1979. Next week we'll come back and review all of the modern revolutions and the theories that apply to them, as well as review the basic facts that we've covered in the second half of the course.